I have worked behind this bar for 16 years. I have heard confessions, sworn truths, and tall tales that fray at the edges but never fully. That night the neon outside blinked like a tired warning, and the rain stitched the window panes together. The jukebox hummed an old country song, low and steady, and the radio over the dartboard kept cutting out between stations. A man came in, soaked to the skin, smelled of wet earth and diesel, and when he sat at the corner of the counter, he did not look for company. He looked for someone who would hold his story without judging. He said one line at first that I still hear when the wind shifts. "I do not want to be the kind of man who tells lies about what took his brother." He set a damp envelope on the bar and pushed it toward me like it was both confession and proof. The ice in my glass clicked the way a metronome clicks before a fall. I promised then to listen, because that is what we do in this town. We listen, and sometimes what we hear is the map of a thing that follows the dark. "My name is Ethan Cole," the man at that counter said. "I used to fix tractors for a living. Then the feed mill went under and I ran odd jobs for people around town. My brother Mark kept the old family farm out past the gravel road at Boone Hollow. He was a quiet man, the kind who mended fences before dawn, who could say more with a nod than most could with a speech. He smelled of motor oil and wood smoke, his hands were large and steady, his laugh came slow and full. After our father died, Mark stayed on the land. He did not like strangers, but he took in a stray dog once and fed a couple of needy kids on Sundays. He kept the place honest. When I say he was my brother, I mean he was the measure of the way we were raised, the way we learned how to wake up and work until the light left the fields. In the year before he disappeared, he started waking at odd hours, found prints in the mud that did not match boots or tires, and came home with his shirt torn at the sleeve once, like someone had grabbed him and then let go. He said he could smell something on the porch at night that was not animal and not human, like iron and damp fur and something older. He told me once that when he stood on the steps and looked into the tree line, he could sense a shadow move with purpose, as if it were counting him. He swore to me that he had never been the kind of man to scare easily. Then he stopped sleeping through a night. He started carrying a rifle even during the day, and he left the porch light on even when no one was coming. He began to mark the trail behind the barn with small piles of stones, like breadcrumbs for the kind of fear that eats memory. When he vanished, it left a cut on the town we tried to stitch closed with talk and supposition. The first signs were small and wrong in a way that made the hair on your neck stand up. Footprints showed up along the ridge behind Mark's barn, shallow but stretched, as if the thing that made them put its foot down with a flat, long motion. They had 5 points like toes, but the spacing was all wrong. The heel off to the side, and the pads more like an old boot with missing nails. Neighbors mentioned scratches on the silo that looked like talon marks, not clawed by any animal we could name. There was a smell that came and went, a metallic wetness, like someone had been chewing on pennies, and it lingered in the corners of the shed where the lights did not reach. On the second night, I went out with Mark to look, because a brother does not let the other walk into a shadow alone. We cut through fog that sat heavy against the trees, the kind of fog that closes like a lid. The radio in the pickup fluttered between channels, catching words from a distant station that made no sense. Mark shone his flashlight along the fence line and swore under his breath when he saw tracks that started in his pasture and stopped at the edge of the woods like the world itself had been unstitched. The first backstory I tell you is not mine alone. It is the ledger of a life lived close to the land, then unmade by something that refused to be named. I grew up with a father who taught us to read the sky for rain, to mend the milk pails when they cracked, to understand that the world has margins where law and logic thin. That upbringing taught me to be practical and to trust what my hands could prove. It did not teach me how to measure a face that is wrong at a glance, how to account for eyes that reflect light as if they had been made to hold fire. There were 3 nights that changed everything. The first was the night Mark went missing. We had argued earlier that evening, stupid things about fences and money, the quick kind of anger that leaves a taste like iron. He had gone down to check the east gate after supper. I remember the kitchen lights swinging when I turned back for a cup of coffee, the radio in the corner playing a song that sounded like a memory. When I walked out, the door was open and the porch light was on. The tracks started at the corn crib, not from the road. They were long and they curved along the creek like someone had been walking too carefully for comfort. I called his name and heard nothing but the frogs and the distant hum of highway trucks. I followed the trail until it stopped at the tree line where the air smelled of cold metal. The sound I heard then was not a growl or a howl. It was a high clicking, like teeth on glass, and the hair on my arms crawled up because in my gut something told me Mark was not going to step back across that line. I ran until my lungs burned, and then I found the overturned bucket, a smear on the grass, and the rifle leaning against the fence with mud on the stock. There was no body. I found a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch, and an envelope sealed with a smear of red clay. Inside was a scrap of paper with a note in his handwriting. Only 2 words. Don't follow. The confrontation that followed in town was where the sheriff and the deputy met us with practiced faces. Sheriff Harris was a broad man with calloused hands, a man who had run for sheriff on being the kind of person who would dig until he found answers. Deputy Lopez had a calm voice like an anchor and wore his badge low on his chest like it might weigh him down. They took the envelope, photographed the prints, and called in a forensic from the city, Dr. Alvarez, who drove up in a van that smelled like rain and antiseptic. They ran tests on hair samples found near the barn and on the torn fabric. The report came back later with words that tried to be scientific and failed at comforting. The hair was coarse, not matching any local species we had photos of. The DNA was contaminated or incomplete, a tangle that fingered at primate markers but then slid away into unknown sequences. The sheriff put the case into a drawer and labeled it Predatory Incident Pending. In public, he told neighbors to lock doors and keep dogs close. In private, he came by with a thermos and sat at my kitchen table and said with a hoarseness I had not noticed before, "We do not have the threads to make a coat from this cloth. We can talk about wolves until we are thin, but I know when a man is telling me truth." He looked at me and said with a face that was more exhausted than angry, "This thing is not a wolf." The first major scene of confrontation at Mark's barn became the story everyone repeated at gatherings, told and retold until small details frayed and new ones grew. It started with a chain of 8 dialogue exchanges between me, Sheriff Harris, Deputy Lopez, Dr. Alvarez, Carol the neighbor, my Uncle Ben, and a young hunter named Lucas who swore he had seen eyes like lanterns. I asked Lucas how long the prints were. He said about the length of a man's step, but long in the toes. I asked if the marks were clawed. He said no, like when you drag a ladder across a roof. I asked if he had followed them. He said I did, but they stopped. I asked if there was hair. He said there was hair thick like rope. I asked what the hair smelled like. He said like old pennies and wet leaves. I asked if anyone had heard a sound. Carol said she heard a clicking and something that hummed like wind through a bottle. I asked if we could set a trap. Sheriff Harris said we would try, but traps are for animals that are animals. Ben said that if it comes back, he would bring his old double barrel and stand the night with us. Dr. Alvarez said we should collect samples carefully and not disturb the prints. Deputy Lopez agreed and suggested cameras. The tension in those exchanges sat heavy as we planned, each sentence a stone thrown into a well. We set the trap in the field with lights around the perimeter, motion sensors wired to an old truck battery, and cameras that fed to a hard drive kept in the trunk of my car. We took shifts through the night, and this night became the second major moment of tension, described over 3 long paragraphs that compressed to visceral memory. The fog sat low as a blanket, and the smell of damp iron hung near the fence. My hands were steady on the rifle at first, controlled like a man doing a job he knows how to do. Then the radio started to cut in with static, and to sound like a soft hum threaded into the static. Something out there tapped the top of the pickup like a knuckle on wood. I swung the light and saw nothing but trees and the shimmer of breath. The motion sensor went off twice for small animals, and we laughed out of relief that cracked like a brittle bone. Around 2 in the morning, Lucas whispered that he could see a shadow move between the birches like a person trying on the dark. Suddenly, a blow hit the side of the truck so hard, the cab vibrated and the glass rattled. Ben shouted and fired a warning over the ridge, and the sound of the shot rolled back to us like thunder. The thing made a sound that was not a scream and not a howl. It was a wet, low rattle that dissolved into the fog. When we went out at dawn, the cameras had captured nothing but the light strobing and one frame of shadow bending at a wrong angle, like a man with the shoulders of a wolf and the hips of a human. We found fresh, elongated prints that started at the gate and walked away toward the creek. They were deeper in the middle, as if the foot had a strange pad that pushed and rolled. The incident that finally tipped into a disappearance was sudden and precise. On a warm night in June, my neighbor Carol heard dogs barking and horns from trucks that seemed to echo from the highway, but came from nowhere like a hallucination. She called me, and by the time I reached her, she was on her porch under the yellow porch light with her hands white around the rail. She said Mark had been out checking the south fence, and then his truck was found abandoned on the gravel road with the driver door open. There was a smear on the seat and mud trail leading away into the timber. We called Sheriff Harris. He sent Deputy Lopez with a pair of deputies named James and Hollis. They combed the field, followed the trail to the creek, and then lost it where the earth seemed gouged and wrong. The thing left behind a scrap of leather we all recognized as part of Mark's jacket. The forensic set took photos, bagged the fabric, labeled everything with practiced words, but the air had changed. The town pulled together. Neighbors drove their lights down to the edge of the woods, and we walked in lines like a search party, voices low, radios clicking between us so we could keep track. Someone found a piece of paper at the base of an oak with a small circle of stones around it. The paper had a childlike sketch of 2 trees and a ladder and the word "stay." The sheriff took it and frowned in a way that made us all quieter. The investigation had official steps and half measures that revealed more about our limits than about the creature. Dr. Alvarez returned with a team, took soil samples that smelled faintly of copper, and sent off hair for analysis with chains of custody that made the tech in me nod. The county sent a perimeter team for a week and then cut back to nightly drives. We recorded audio at night and played it through filters until the sounds separated into clicks, low rumbles, and something like breathing. The sheriff filed reports that used safe words, avoided the phrase "Dogman," and marked the case under a code that kept insurance from being triggered. A state wildlife officer inspected, but said the tracks did not match any species on record. The response felt both thorough and hollow. They closed the file to public inquiries, but kept a copy in a locked folder. Ben refused to accept that a man could vanish. He slept with a lantern by his bed and went out at random times to sit by the old fence. He told me once that guilt has a sound like a neighbor who will not stop knocking. I felt that guilt. When the investigators asked me questions about Mark's habits, and I remembered everything I had not said to him in time. The town changed schedules, and the bar saw more men come in with a look like someone who had stained their hands and could not wash them clean. People stopped walking the creek after dusk. Dogs howled more, and sleep thinned. About a month after Mark went missing, I received the envelope I mentioned. It contained photographs taken at night, prints magnified and grainy, and a letter in my brother's handwriting that said, "Do not go after me," and then a second line in a different hand that was not mine and not Mark's that read, "You will bring others." It was the thing of horror and tenderness that broke into the way we moved. After that, another man came to the bar, and told a story from across the county line. A trucker named Merrick who swore his rig was shoved off a logging road by something that stood on two legs and looked down at him like a taller dog could look down at a rabbit. Merrick was a broad man with a burr of a voice who had driven cross-country for 20 years. He told a scene with 8 exchanges between him and his partner Doug, a dispatcher named Carol in the truck stop who patched them over the radio, and a sheriff's deputy who later took the report. Merrick said he felt something measuring the cab, sniffing the air like a hunter that uses scent to choose. He said the thing smelled of wet fur and old coins, and that it had an upright posture that made the truck feel small and fragile. The deputy who responded, a man named Hollis, stamped his boot in the dirt and said he had seen prints that matched those we had at Boone Hollow. In Merrick's version, the creature had left marks on the truck like scratches from a hand too long to belong to a man, and a dent in the hood that looked like someone had punched with a fist that was too large to be human. The community began to draw a map with pins and notes. We mapped sightings from farmsteads to logging roads, from the ridge to a small park where kids had once been told to keep off. Each pin was a bleed on the map. A shorter anecdote came from Lucas, the young hunter, who 2 weeks after the truck incident found an envelope on his porch. Inside was a folded scrap of a newspaper clipping about a missing dog from a neighboring county, and a typed note that read, "Keep your dogs close." Lucas took his shotgun and sat all night under the porch light. At dawn, he found prints that led to the creek and then stopped on a stone, as if whoever or whatever had been there had knelt and then vanished. He told us the sheriff had come and photographed the prints and then drove away, and later a man in a dark suit from a federal office called the sheriff and said the case would be handled at the state level. The involvement of authorities changed nothing about the nights that followed. The cameras we set up in the fields recorded movement but no faces, silhouettes that bent wrong, and voices that made no sense until the files vanished from our hard drives or turned blank at the frames where something should have been visible. Along the way, we named people into the story so it would hold, 5 to 8 faces who did not want to be famous for a thing that stalked the dark. There was Carol, the neighbor who watched from her porch and kept a pot of coffee warm in case someone needed it. There was Uncle Ben, who refused to let the land forget its rituals. There was Lucas, the hunter, who brought salt and a prayer he did not name. There was Merrick, the trucker, who kept rolling through the night but never the same again. There was Sheriff Harris and Deputy Lopez and Dr. Alvarez, who tried to bring laboratory light to a phenomenon that laughed at neat lines. Each of them did specific acts. Carol left a lantern by the east gate. Ben nailed a plank across the basement hatch. Lucas salted the threshold. Merrick replaced the side mirror of his rig and kept the broken one on his dash as a reminder. The sheriff recorded statements and carried a thermos. Dr. Alvarez cataloged hair samples in sterile envelopes and spoke to us with the tones of someone trying to translate dread into data. There were at least 3 moments of acute tension I remember in fine grain, each a block of memory that takes longer to tell than the ears want to hear. The first happened when we tried a stakeout at the ridge and a shadow leaned over the cab of my truck and breathed through the open window. The breath smelt like pennies and old hay and made the cigarette I had been holding go out. The second was when a camera we placed under the barn caught a frame of motion so fast the sensor blurred the silhouette into a smear with 2 points of light where eyes should be. We replayed that frame until dawn, and the image became a kind of evidence that could not be interpreted. The third was when a dog named Porter, a loyal mutt from Carol's porch, ran after something into the dark and was found hours later with his eyes cloudy and his jaw broken, and he would not look me in the face again. Each of these moments filled our nights with a kind of waiting that pressed like a thumb on the throat. We tried patterns that felt like logic. We left offerings of salt at thresholds. We lit circles of oil lamps and waited. We set cameras and left food to see what might come. The sheriff tried to get drones to overfly the property, but the signal kept dropping in the exact coordinates where the prints began. The lab tried to analyze chemical residues and found traces of iron and a compound that did not match familiar animal scents. I taped photographs to the wall of the bar, and we stared at them between customers. The radio started to feel like a chorus, and sometimes late at night it would flicker to a station playing an old hymn that none of us remembered learning. The neighbor Carol kept a list of sightings in the drawer of her table and added a small note that read, "Do not go near the creek after midnight." We followed that instruction, and still it felt like a challenge. Around a third of the way through what became our shared narrative, I asked you to speak to us in the comments if you knew anything like this. If you were sitting at that counter, what would you do? If you have seen something strange, start your reply with, "In my town," or "I saw," and tell us where the prints were, what the smell was, and if you have any photos. Tell the story plainly so others can piece it together. Your accounts have helped in other cases by showing patterns that were invisible when we only had one voice. If you have a photo, attach it. If you can describe the time of night and what the moon was doing, include that. We are not asking for sensationalism, we are asking for detail. Your memories matter here. They turn whispers into maps, and maps into a chance we did not have before. Now, back to the nights on the ridge and the envelope that changed everything. After months of fruitless searching, a man from a state game commission named Hall visited and told me quietly that sometimes the land keeps secrets, and sometimes it throws them up. He said in his experience, animals do not act like this, and men rarely tell us the truth about fear. He said it was not his place to call it monster or spirit, but that the prints were consistent across cases in ways that made his hair stand on end. The county placed signs warning campers, but the logging still went on. Some families sold their land and moved away. The feed store closed on account of fewer customers after dark. The bar, my bar, became a place where people could come and lower the load of their heads for a while. I carried the envelope in my pocket for weeks like a compass that points to a hole. 6 months in, someone mounted a simple wooden marker on the ridge with a painted name to remind us. It was not official, but it was a memory someone could look at and put a face on. People leave flowers now at the marker, and candles occasionally. The sheriff told us to keep the files together, and he kept visiting with coffee and a worn face. Dr. Alvarez published a cautious note to colleagues asking for comparison data from other rural incidents. No formal label fit. The public narrative drifted toward legend and toward rumor. Some people said our town was cursed. Others said it was an opportunity to attract curiosity seekers. We shut down the curiosity seekers with rumpled faces and the truth that the place was still soft underfoot. After 1 month, there was a flicker of community response. People put up extra lighting along the roads. Neighbors teamed up into patrol shifts and carried radios with batteries charged. A search party combed the creek and left markers. After 3 months, we had a log of 12 sightings and a stack of photographs, some genuine and some of hunters crouched with flashlights in the woods. The sheriff organized a meeting with neighboring counties and the wildlife department, and they compared notes like mapmakers trying to draw a coastline that keeps changing shape. After 6 months, the town had a ritual now. We went to the marker, said names, and then we went home and closed our doors early. The bar stayed open later for people who could not sleep. Some mornings there would be 3 or 4 new people at the counter with stories that fit or nearly fit. The pattern of sightings suggested a corridor that ran from the old logging road down past Boone Hollow and toward a strip of woods that had once been a swamp. People began to talk about ancient things and about the land holding on to a manner of life that included predators larger than memory. The epilogue is long in time and short on answers. 1 month after Mark's disappearance, the sheriff had a press conference and called the incident under investigation. He spoke in guarded sentences and thanked volunteers. 3 months in, the county placed extra patrols at night, and Dr. Alvarez had backlogs in his lab, but released an intermediate report that said certain markers were anomalous, though inconclusive. 6 months later, the marker stood on the ridge with flowers and a wind ginger tied to it. For me, the work of living with the memory required more mundane actions. I burned out the light bulbs in the porch until I learned to sleep with a lantern by the bed. I taught my sons to look for tracks that do not match shoes, to check for hair in the brush, to count the number of toes as if that would save them. The town taught itself to measure time differently. Months passed, and people moved to a cadence of caution. I will tell you what I know in simple terms. There were prints that did not belong to any catalogued animal. There were scrapes and a metallic scent that returned in different places. The authorities did what they could within the limits of their manuals and their budgets. The rest was left to neighbors who watched and to a community that stitched warnings into fences. We lost Mark in a way that left no single point of closure. Sometimes closure is a scene of bones in the sun, an answer that will sit cold but final. Our closure was a blank space at the table and the slow rearrangement of daily life. If you find yourself near the ridge at night, do not go alone. Bring a flashlight, write down times, and, if you can, leave something that might deter curiosity. Be mindful. If you have footage or prints, photograph them and do not disturb the scene until officers or scientists can collect material. Keep dogs close. Record radio transmissions and note the state of the weather. These are small things, but they are the way we gather threads to make something solid out of rumor. I keep the envelope tucked in a drawer now. Sometimes, when the rain falls like a shush, I take it out and smooth the paper and read Mark's handwriting and feel the shape of what is missing. I talk about it because the telling keeps the memory from being swallowed whole. The community keeps telling itself to be careful and to watch. The sheriff still comes by and leaves a thermos. Dr. Alvarez still asks for samples from anyone who thinks they have something. Merrick still drives through but avoids that logging road. Lucas checks his cameras with hands that do not shake anymore, or at least not as often. Carol still leaves a light on, and Ben still walks the fence. Sometimes at night I hear a sound beyond the town, a low click or a breath that seems to come from under the world. And I remember the way Mark paused on his porch and said, "Don't follow." Where I work, where I have listened for 16 years, the bar keeps a ledger of small stories that are not closed, a drawer of envelopes, and a chair with a place for anyone who needs to tell the truth. If you have seen something like we have seen, tell us plainly in the comments. If you have a photo, a time, a note, share it. The pattern is a map only when we have more pins on it. If you cannot say anything, then at least remember to check for prints and for the smell of iron in the night air. If there are footprints that do not match, if there are scratches that do not belong to known animals, if the radio catches an old station at the same minute every night, write it down. We are making a record. We are trying not to let another family carry the silence. And finally, if you ask me what kind of thing walks like man and moves like a ghost, I will say only what I have seen and held. I will not invent miracles to comfort you. I will tell you that somewhere between the creek and the pines there is a trail that does not belong to our maps, and there are prints that do not match our shoes. That is all I can say with certainty. Where there are footprints that do not match, there are questions that no one wanted to answer. If you know any answers, come tell us. If you do not, keep your porch light on and count the hours until dawn.